Thinking of God's sovereignty and how He has worked through the years. Bonnie and I were at Westside for many years, had a good ministry there. The last year was a very difficult, painful transition year. We left with some wounds and hurts that took probably 2 years to heal up. But God brought Pastor Rick in to help bring peace and to help bring reconciliation, and then to bring this outward focus. And it's just been exciting to hear how God has blessed at Westside in Yakima. When we left Yakima, we said, God, we have no idea where you want us to go next. A search committee had been formulated where Scott's dad, Pastor Thielen Kent, was in LeGrand. He had just resigned. A search committee had been formulated, and they came asking about us, and we happened at that point to be just resigning in Yakima, and so we ended up in LeGrand. Well, Scott's dad had hired Rick McKinley, who was a youth pastor there in LeGrand when we arrived. Our daughter was a senior in high school, and we were concerned about how she'd make the transition, and God had Rick there to be able to help with all of that, and so exciting times. I remember the first time that I took Rick to the auction barn, and he had never been to an auction barn before, and so it was a cross-cultural experience for him. We sat in the auction barn for a while and experienced that, and then we got in the truck and we were driving away, and I was talking a little bit about my dad, and I referred to AI, and Rick kind of had this puzzled look and he said, now, what's AI? And I said, well, that's artificial insemination. And he looked at me and he said, what? And so that was another education that we had to go through a little bit. But Rick had a burden laid upon his heart to want to come and start a church in Portland, and God bless that. I want to show you a picture of an early church planter. Many of you have been around for a long time will remember this first slide here. This is Harold MacArthur. This is Paul MacArthur's father. Paul ministering in Alaska, but Harold was planting a church in Halfway, Oregon when Bonnie and I went to Enterprise, and I became the pastor at Enterprise, just over the Willow Mountains away. Harold had also started a church in Stanfield, and I think he started some other churches, so he's an early church planter, but he experienced ranch life in Prineville, growing up in Prineville, and so he had this background, and so there you can see he's holding his Bible and he's on his horse, and this is Harold's saddle right here that his daughter was able to loan to me so I could bring it as an illustration of how Harold used his background to touch the hearts of people that he had just an instant rapport with because of what he had experienced in his own upbringing. And God used that to help get those churches going in those out of the way places. What we did with Harold is he came up with the idea. He said, why don't we do a pulpit exchange? I'll ride from Halfway. We'll meet you halfway up in the Willow Mountains. You come from Enterprise. So Bonnie and I, we saddled up and we rode 25 or 30 miles in, camped with Harold overnight. Then he went and preached in Enterprise, and I went and preached in Halfway. But there was something that was happening. Even when that went into the newspaper, it was saying something to the communities in which we live about trying to build a relationship with them. I'm talking about sometimes what can be around us but somewhat neglected. I'm talking about livestock-oriented families, 4-H kind of families, FFA kind of families, rodeo people, horses, cows, wheat ranchers, John Wayne kind of people that just kind of like the Western heritage. And in some places you'll be able to identify with this, in other places you say this doesn't relate to me at all. But I think the principles will, because the Apostle Paul, as a church planter, said that there is something about studying the worlds in which we live and the cultures around us and then becoming all things to all men. For this is what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 9. I have made myself a slave to all. To the Jews I became as a Jew. To those under the law as one that is under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law. To those who are weak I became weak. I have become all things to all people. Why was Paul willing to sacrifice his own personal preferences in order to serve other people by becoming like they were, to incarnate himself into their lives and to serve them, even though the cultural differences might have been great at that time? he made clear what his motives were. In the same text, he says, "Why become as they are? So that I might win more of them, that I might win Jews, that I might win those under the law, that I might win those outside the law, that I might win the weak, that I might by all means save some." He became as they were in order that they might become as he was, ultimately to lead them to the Lord, to save them. This is an important part of evangelism strategy. And so let me tell you a little bit about my story and the burden that's on my heart now. The next picture that you'll see is a picture of the home place where my mom and dad lived for over 40 years now. And in the state of Texas is where I grew up. This is the Texas Hill Country, not far from San Antonio, up in the Hill Country area. That's an old German farmhouse that was built in 1900. And so when we'd served in LeGrand for 10 years, they gave us a sabbatical for 3 months. And I told Bon, let's hook up the RV, take the truck, and go to Texas and spend the winter in Texas. So this is where we spent our time while we were there. And it was really a special time because we were getting to that age now where we're thinking, what's the last chapter of our ministry lives would look like? We started in Enterprise, then we went to Yakima, and now we're in LeGrand, 3 different chapters. But what would the last chapter look like? This next picture is a picture of my dad while we were there. Dad was almost 85 years old in this picture. And he'd make a good poster boy for Don't Mess with Texas as he carries those 2 .30-30 rifles. But it tells you a little bit about what God birthed me into and what I experienced in growing up that also is part of the fabric of who I am that may help me to be able to have rapport and reach people that have similar kind of cultural experiences. So I don't believe that was by accident. While we were there that winter, we drove down to Devine, Texas. I had met a friend at a Sproul conference in Florida. I looked around, and he was the only guy that was wearing Wrangler jeans, and I said, I got to meet that fellow. So I talked with him, and he was starting a church down in Devine, Texas, out behind a cotton gin in an open-air shed. So this next picture you'll see, this is where the church meets. And by that time, they had almost 200 people that were meeting in that shed. And they called it a Cowboy Fellowship, the Cowboy Church of Medina County. But he said if I had to name it over again, I wouldn't put Cowboy on it because I'd say maybe country or something like that. They're people that appreciate the Western heritage, but very few of them were ranchers or farmers. But they were people that were comfortable coming into this kind of a setting and being able to dress the way they were and not feel like they had to dress up. If they had a little manure on their boots, that would be acceptable. Nobody would even think about it or see it. And so, as a result, they were reaching a lot of people. And what I found out is the Southern Baptists in the state of Texas are planting these Cowboy Fellowships like crazy. I think there's over 200 Southern Baptist churches that have now planted Cowboy churches in the state of Texas. And what they're discovering is there's a whole neglected group of people that we haven't been speaking their language. And so they are baptizing far more people in those country fellowships than they are in their traditional Baptist churches. And then of those that are being baptized, almost 80% of them are adults. And of those 80% adults that are being baptized, 80% of those are men. Men that have never darkened the door of a church, that more than likely you would never get them to come to what looks like a traditional church. But as we saw that and heard that and experienced it down there, God began to develop a burden in my heart. And I told Bonnie, I said, you know, I just feel like the last chapter of our life, if there's any way, I'd like to focus in on people that I just have instant rapport with and have a burden for. So the next picture is a picture of the valley that we live in, the Grand Ronde Valley. And so we did some demographic study and found out there's 500 people that live inside the city of LeGrand, with Eastern Oregon University and a different kind of city life inside the town. But there's 12,500 people that live in the county that are very much a different tribe, a different ethne, and there's quite a contrast between the two. So we're at the point now where we have to start a second service, and we were thinking, why do a duplicate service in the auditorium exactly the same, reaching the same target audience? Why not go off campus and start a second service that would target the 12,500 people in the valley that are a little different than the city people. So we began to pray about that as elders and talk about it as a church, and we're still in the praying and talking stages. And Rick mentioned that all the people were ready, and the bulk of the people are. But some are a little bit skeptical about this whole idea of maybe a target group different than what we've been doing. So this is what God began to do. I began to pray about it. We came home with this burden. This has been about 4 years ago now, so it's been a patient process. And then I had a rancher friend that said, listen, I found a horse that is a free horse. And so he gave me this horse, and my wife said, there is no such thing as a free horse. And that is true. There are some expenses that go along with it. But she's about an 8-year-old now, and she is a Jim Dandy. And it brings me back to my Texas root to be able to come home in the afternoon and after work at the office and to be able to get on a horse and go for a ride. So I started helping with my friend who helped line this out for me. And let me just tell you this. You may think, well, Texas, you're a real cowboy. That's not true. I'm mostly a wannabe cowboy. But what I found is, if you're a wannabe, wherever God's planted you, and you hang out with cowboys, and if you're humble enough to be taught and show an interest in becoming like them, they will bend over backwards trying to take a greenhorn and turn you into a cowboy. If you just value what they value and love what they love, and love on them. So that's part of what God's been doing. Let me show you. This is my friend. My friend's name is Bob, and he's got lots of friends that he invites to help with roundups, and so we were gathered together, and if you think that's a Coke in his hand, it's not a Coke. There'd probably be, that's a bottle, a can of beer, and in the back pocket he might have a thing of whiskey. And so we started out together and we built a friendship. There's not a person there in that group that goes to, are church-going people. And if you can even look at this, you can say, does that look like a little bit of a different tribe than maybe what you're used to? It is. It's a different language. It's a different culture. But I believe they're a neglected group in our area, and there's lots of them. And so we started doing brandings together and roundups together and built a relationship. Bob and Sandy have come to church a few times now with me. I remember one time we were doing a branding, and we had a cow that jumped over the top of a pen, went out. In fact, anyway, Bob got a little upset. And I mean, he cussed a whole bunch of us out. I mean, just blue streak, one from the other. And I'm sitting there as a preacher thinking, man, doesn't he know I'm a preacher? He shouldn't be talking to me like that. And the last branding that we had this last time, we had a cow jumped 3 fences and got completely out, was headed out into the pasture afterwards. Not one cuss word came out of Bob's mouth this year. Spirit of God is working on Bob and Sandy, and I think if possible he's already accepted Christ, but we just haven't had a chance to hear him confess that or be baptized yet. These are country folks that are being neglected. So we started brainstorming and saying, God, what would be a good location? And this is the building that we are considering. It's still available right now. It's between the Flying J truck stop and the auction barn where I took Rick, and it's right on the main road. And it looks very intimidating to country kind of people. And so we're hoping that this might be a possibility if we go ahead as a church. Inside the building, it looks something like this. This is where we would hold our worship service inside this area. And so if you can imagine a country gospel kind of band, a worship band in that setting, maybe some bluegrass kind of flavor to it. And we'd be sitting on either lawn chairs or patio chairs there. If when you walk in, there'd be saddles used for decoration and ropes and hats on the wall and Western art and photographs, so that when they walk in, they're feeling very comfortable with who they are as we try to reach out to them. I'm hoping that our church will completely embrace the idea of becoming a mother. We were thinking just start a second service, do 2 services. I preach both, and in a transition time that may be the best way, but the elders are thinking now, we really believe that ultimately this needs to be a church plant, and it would be self-sustaining and have its own identity. And so At this age, Bonnie and I are looking at becoming possible church planters in the next couple of years if God should lead us this way and the church should endorse it to go forward, and I hope and pray that they will. This whole country idea may not relate to you or to your world where you are, but Paul's strategy is a good one because it involves becoming as people are, loving on them, serving them, seeking them, those on the outside. What kind of tribes, what kind of ethnies are around us? I think that's the whole point of why we're gathered here and saying, God, place a burden, help us to love these people and try to reach them for Christ. Jerusalem, Judea, and even Samaria. Become as they are, that they might become as we are. Incarnate the gospel into their lives. A few months ago, our daughter wrote a poem and sent it to us, and I thought I'd like to end with that this morning. She's living over in the Bend area now. And Rick, I want to publicly thank you for loving our daughter and helping her in those transition years of her life, too. She entitled it, I Want to be around lots of people who have not decided to believe in God yet, and then I want to be able to speak clearly and frankly and boldly with them about all the things that truly matter. Life, love, Jesus, creation, death, life after death, where things have come from, where we are going, and anything else on their hearts and minds. I want to see people feel and taste the trueness of God for the first time. To be near them while God pursues them and becomes real in their life for the first time. To welcome them into new life. Welcome them into purpose, meaning, hope, security. Welcome them into a new family as well. I want to throw a party for them. I want to tell them that the road will not be easy, but they have chosen the best road. That their fight has been fought, their rest will come through repentance, and that I look forward to spending eternity with them along with all the others who have chosen to surrender to God as their Savior and friend. I want this to be every day, and then I will die and not be dead. I pray that God would lay this burden on all of our hearts and that He would bring these dreams to fruition as we try to reach people for Christ. Thank you.